I remember the streets of Brooklyn as if they were a living, breathing entity. The narrow sidewalks, the faint hum of distant traffic, the smell of old brick and warm summer air. They shaped every boy who walked them, including Roy DeMeo. Roy was quiet in his own way, though there was a subtle strength about him even as a child. He observed people carefully, learning patterns in how they spoke, how they moved, and how they reacted to one another. It was this early observation that would later define him. Growing up, Roy's neighborhood was a mixture of ordinary life and whispers of the world of organized families. Children played in the streets, shopkeepers called out greetings, and men in suits passed with careful glances. Roy was curious, but he also learned quickly that silence could be powerful. He didn't rush into things. He didn't boast. Instead, he watched. And in watching, he began to understand the quiet rules that guided human behavior. Rules that would later help him navigate the complex world he would inhabit. Even as a young man, Roy had a keen sense of people. He could sense intentions without being told. He could detect subtle tensions in a room, the unspoken rules that governed interactions. He started running errands for neighbors, helping out in small ways, and listening quietly. And through these small tasks he gained something valuable: trust. People began to notice that Roy was dependable, that he could handle situations without creating unnecessary attention. This reliability would become one of his greatest assets in life. I remember an afternoon where he was simply observing a disagreement among local boys. He didn't intervene. He didn't speak. But he watched. And later, when the situation needed resolution, he acted, not impulsively, but deliberately, using information he had quietly gathered. That patience and observation became a defining feature of his character. Roy DeMeo's life was never straightforward. Even in his youth, he carried a sense of duality. On the surface, he could blend into the world, ordinary and unassuming. Beneath, he understood the currents of power, loyalty, and influence that most ignored. He learned early that appearances could be misleading, and that understanding human nature allowed him to operate in a way few others could. He began to develop the careful balance of visibility and invisibility, a double life that would define much of his adult years. Even in seemingly ordinary interactions, he practiced patience and restraint. The streets taught him that timing and observation often mattered more than force or speed. And in this quiet learning, he prepared for a life that would require precision, subtlety, and discretion. Roy's first encounters with members of the Gambino family were subtle. He didn't announce himself with grand gestures or bold claims. He observed, helped, and learned. The elders noticed his quiet reliability. They recognized that he understood people, that he could operate without creating unnecessary waves, and that he had a natural sense of strategy. I remember hearing about a small task he handled in those early days. It wasn't remarkable on the surface. A delivery, a conversation, a careful watch, but he executed it flawlessly. Those small victories, unnoticed by many, quietly built his reputation. By the time he was fully involved, he had established trust through calm action and careful observation. People knew Roy DeMeo could be counted on to handle sensitive matters without drawing attention or creating unnecessary conflict. Even in these early years, there was something remarkable about Roy. He carried himself with quiet authority, patience, and observation. He understood that the world rewarded subtlety more than loudness, and reliability more than bravado. And so began the double life. On one hand, a man blending into ordinary life, earning respect through diligence and thoughtfulness. On the other, a man quietly navigating the complex, hidden structures of power, trust, and loyalty in Brooklyn's shadows. It was in this duality that Roy DeMeo began to shape a life that would later become legendary. Not through force or spectacle, but through patience, observation, and subtle influence. As Roy became more involved with the Gambino family, I noticed how naturally he earned the trust of those around him. He didn't demand it. He didn't boast. He simply observed, listened, and acted quietly yet effectively. Even in situations that seemed delicate or unpredictable, Roy approached them with calm logic. He understood people's fears, their desires, and the subtle ways in which they revealed themselves. And because of that understanding, others began to rely on him. I remember a meeting in a small, dimly lit room. Older men debated and disagreed, voices occasionally rising. Roy said almost nothing. He simply listened, watching expressions, noting pauses, and observing reactions. And when he finally spoke, his suggestion resolved the conflict effortlessly. People looked at him with quiet respect, realizing that his calm insight carried weight far beyond his years. Roy's double life became more pronounced as he gained influence. On the surface, he remained an ordinary man, friendly, approachable, almost invisible. But beneath that exterior, he operated in a world of strategy, loyalty, and responsibility that few could imagine. He learned early that visibility could be dangerous. By staying calm, quiet, and unassuming, he avoided drawing unnecessary attention while remaining fully aware of everything happening around him. I often thought about how unusual it was. While others moved hastily or acted impulsively, Roy's life was guided by observation and patience. Every decision was deliberate, every action intentional, and every silence carefully measured. I recall one particular situation where tensions were high. The disagreement could have escalated quickly, yet Roy approached it with a level of composure that was remarkable. He didn't try to dominate the conversation. He didn't attempt to show power through force or volume. Instead, he listened, understood, and subtly guided the discussion toward resolution. It was a reminder that influence doesn't always need noise or aggression. Sometimes, quiet reasoning and careful timing are far more powerful than any outward display of authority. By the time Roy was in his 20s, he had begun to establish a quiet reputation. People trusted him not because he was flashy or loud, but because he was reliable, thoughtful, and observant. Even those who didn't know him well noticed the difference. There was something about the way he carried himself. A calm confidence, an unassuming presence, a patient approach that drew respect naturally. His reputation grew steadily, quietly, and it was rooted in consistency. He handled every situation carefully, avoiding unnecessary risks, and ensuring that trust was never broken. Perhaps the most important lesson Roy exemplified was patience. I watched him repeatedly choose to wait, to observe, to consider outcomes before acting. While others rushed, he paused. While others reacted impulsively, he planned. And in that patience lay his greatest strength. People underestimated him because he didn't act hastily. They overlooked him because he didn't seek attention. But by waiting, he always positioned himself advantageously, quietly shaping events around him. It was clear that Roy's patience was not passivity, it was strategy. He understood that in life, as in his world, timing often mattered more than speed, and observation often mattered more than action. Though Roy's role would later be described as that of an enforcer, I saw it differently. He wasn't loud or ostentatious. He didn't need to assert himself with force. He enforced through presence, intelligence, and subtle influence. People around him knew that his words carried weight. His calm judgment was trusted. And while the world around him could be chaotic, Roy moved through it with deliberate grace, earning respect quietly rather than demanding it. Throughout all this, Roy maintained his double life with remarkable skill. On one side, he blended into ordinary life, approachable and discreet. On the other, he navigated the complex network of the Gambino family, understanding its nuances and responsibilities better than most. I often thought about the discipline required to maintain such a life, to observe without being seen, to act without drawing attention, and to keep personal integrity while handling delicate situations. It was extraordinary. And in this balance, Roy DeMeo built the foundation for the legacy he would leave behind. A life lived carefully, thoughtfully, and with quiet purpose. As Roy became more established in the Gambino family, his influence grew quietly, like an undercurrent in a calm river. He didn't announce himself with power. He didn't dominate rooms with noise or aggression. Instead, he moved through the family's world with a sense of calm authority. I remember watching him guide difficult situations without anyone realizing he was steering the outcome. Conversations, meetings, disputes, all were handled with subtlety, observation, and precise timing. It was a reminder to me that influence isn't always visible. Sometimes it is measured, quiet, and unassuming, and yet its effects can be profound. Roy had a remarkable ability to assess situations before acting. Where others might have relied on intimidation or impulsive decision-making, he relied on strategy and careful observation. Every action was deliberate. Every word had purpose. I recall a time when tensions arose between two factions within the organization. Most expected chaos, but Roy approached it differently. He listened first, understood motivations, and waited. When he spoke, his suggestions seemed simple and natural, yet they resolved conflicts that could have escalated. It was a demonstration of how careful thought and calm strategy often outshine force or noise. Roy's double life was more than a concept, it was a daily practice. During the day, he blended into the streets, approachable and ordinary. People saw a man who seemed relaxed, friendly, even unremarkable. But beneath that calm exterior, he was always observing, calculating, and managing responsibilities that few could comprehend. The skill of living two lives required discipline. It demanded patience, self-control, and awareness. Roy carried it effortlessly, though I always knew it required immense focus. One of Roy's remarkable qualities was his ability to handle challenges without drawing attention. Even in tense or high-pressure moments, he remained calm. He listened, he observed, and he acted only when necessary. His quiet presence often diffused tension before it could escalate. I remember a meeting that could have turned hostile. Voices rose, emotions flared, and yet, Roy's calm, measured words guided the group toward resolution. The effect was almost imperceptible but profound. Roy understood the importance of loyalty, not as something to demand, but as something to inspire. He earned trust by being reliable, consistent, and discreet. People knew he could handle difficult tasks, navigate tricky situations, and maintain discretion. This loyalty wasn't built on fear. It was built on confidence in his judgment and the quiet assurance that he could be counted on. Over time, this loyalty became the foundation of his influence. Though not called the Oddfather, Roy's methods reminded me of a quiet, strategic genius. He created an image of calm, harmless ordinariness that masked the full extent of his intellect and ability. By remaining subtle, he avoided unnecessary attention and could act freely when circumstances demanded it. It was a form of invisibility that allowed him to operate effectively, maintaining his double life while quietly shaping outcomes around him. Perhaps one of Roy's most enduring lessons was the power of restraint. He rarely acted impulsively. He rarely spoke unnecessarily. He understood that patience and discretion often accomplished more than force or speed. I watched him navigate complex situations, choosing silence over words, observation over reaction, and careful timing over hurried action. This restraint became the hallmark of his quiet power. By this stage in his life, Roy had established a presence that few fully understood. He moved quietly, acted subtly, and maintained his double life with remarkable skill. People trusted him, respected him, and sometimes underestimated him. And in that quiet underestimation, Roy thrived. The foundations of his legacy were being laid, not in dramatic displays, but in careful decisions, patience, and subtle influence. By his late 20s, Roy DeMeo had become a trusted figure within the Gambino family. It wasn't because he sought recognition or boasted about his abilities. It was because he had proven time and again that he could handle difficult situations with calm precision. He earned respect quietly, and it was this consistency that set him apart. I remember seeing him in meetings where others tried to dominate with loud voices or aggressive gestures. Roy simply observed, waited, and when he spoke, his words carried clarity and purpose. People listened, sometimes surprised by the depth behind his calm demeanor. Roy's double life had now become a well-oiled practice. On the streets, he was approachable and unassuming, blending seamlessly with everyday life. Within the family, he navigated complex loyalties, responsibilities, and subtle politics. Balancing these two worlds required extraordinary awareness. Yet Roy made it look effortless. He understood that secrecy and discretion were his greatest allies. People underestimated him because they only saw part of the man, and in that invisibility lay his strength. Roy's influence grew not through confrontation but through carefully considered choices. I remember a delicate situation involving competing interests within the family. While others acted hastily, Roy took time to observe, listen, and analyze. When he finally intervened, his decision guided the outcome smoothly, avoiding conflict and preserving loyalty. It was a masterclass in strategic thinking. Every word, every suggestion, every subtle action was deliberate. He shaped outcomes quietly, leaving others to believe resolution had happened naturally. Roy understood that loyalty could not be demanded, it had to be earned. He cultivated relationships with patience, reliability, and discretion. People knew they could trust him to handle delicate matters without gossip, missteps, or unnecessary exposure. This earned trust became the cornerstone of his influence. Allies respected him, rivals acknowledged him, and even outsiders could sense his quiet authority. He didn't need to intimidate. His reliability and judgment did the work for him. What was remarkable about Roy was his presence. Quiet, calm, unassuming. He walked into rooms without drawing attention. He spoke only when necessary. Yet, in his silence and calm, he shaped the flow of conversations, guided decisions, and subtly directed outcomes. People often underestimated him because he didn't need to dominate, and in that underestimation lay his power. Even with mastery, Roy's double life was not without challenges. He had to balance ordinary appearances with the hidden responsibilities of his role. He had to maintain loyalty, navigate complex relationships, and manage risks, all while remaining discreet. I often thought about the discipline required. It was not just intelligence. It was awareness, patience, and a remarkable ability to remain calm under pressure. And Roy managed it all with an effortless grace that few could match. Perhaps the most important lesson from Roy's life was the power of patience. He acted deliberately, choosing the right moment to intervene, speak, or act. He understood that timing mattered more than speed, that observation often mattered more than immediate action. Through patience, he navigated challenges that others would have struggled with. He achieved influence without confrontation, respect without aggression, and success without unnecessary spectacle. In many ways, Roy's methods resembled those of the Oddfather archetype. He created an image of ordinariness, of calm harmlessness, that masked his intelligence, strategic ability, and influence. By appearing unremarkable, he avoided attention and preserved freedom of action. It was a quiet genius, a subtle mastery of perception and action that allowed him to move through life on his own terms. As Roy DeMeo matured, he carried the same calm, deliberate presence that had defined his earlier life. He moved through the world quietly, observing, analyzing, and guiding outcomes without ever seeking recognition. Even as responsibilities increased and pressures grew, he remained steady, a man whose patience and insight allowed him to navigate complexities that would overwhelm most. I often marveled at the balance he maintained, visible enough to earn trust, invisible enough to preserve freedom. Few understood the discipline required to sustain such a life, yet Roy made it appear effortless. One of the most striking things about Roy was his ability to use strategy without drawing attention. A disagreement that might have erupted into conflict could be resolved with a few carefully chosen words, a calm suggestion, or a subtle adjustment of circumstance. It was almost imperceptible, yet its effect was profound. He demonstrated that true mastery often resides in subtlety, patience, and thoughtful observation rather than in aggression or loud assertion. Roy's double life required constant vigilance. He balanced ordinary appearances with extraordinary responsibility, ensuring that loyalty, discretion, and careful judgment guided his every action. This discipline extended beyond his professional obligations. It shaped how he lived, how he thought, and how he moved through the world. It was a life built not on spectacle, but on consistency, trust, and careful thought. And it was in that consistency that his quiet influence was cemented. Roy never needed to intimidate. His calm, reliable judgment inspired trust. His patient approach fostered loyalty. His quiet guidance shaped outcomes without the need for loud commands or displays of force. I often reflected on how rare this form of influence is. It does not seek attention. It does not demand obedience. Yet it endures. And in Roy's life, that quiet influence became his greatest strength. Roy DeMeo's life offers lessons beyond his world. Patience often outweighs impulsiveness. Observation can be more powerful than action. Trust and reliability inspire loyalty far more than fear. Appearances can be tools. Silence can be strategy. A life lived deliberately carries a quiet, lasting influence. Through these lessons, his story resonates not just as a historical account, but as guidance for anyone seeking calm, thoughtful decision-making in a complex world. Even now, people remember Roy DeMeo not for flamboyance or loud exploits, but for the subtle mastery with which he navigated life. He lived a double life, ordinary in appearance, extraordinary in strategy, quiet in action, yet profoundly influential, patient in demeanor, yet decisive when necessary. And that, perhaps, is the enduring legacy of Roy DeMeo, the enforcer with a double life who demonstrated that influence does not require aggression, and that quiet observation often shapes the world more effectively than noise or spectacle ever could. As you listen to the story, imagine walking beside Roy through the streets of Brooklyn. The faint hum of traffic, the warm summer air, the quiet rhythm of a city alive with subtle currents. Feel the calm patience he carried, the deliberate attention to detail, the quiet strength that guided his every move. Let these lessons settle softly around you. Patience, observation, discipline, and subtle influence. And now, as you close your eyes and drift into sleep, let the story of Roy DeMeo fade gently into your mind, leaving behind calm, reflection, and understanding. Sleep well,